It smells of resin, wet wood, and sour steam that curls in the narrow alleyway and sticks to your sleeves. A faded sign with the schedule hangs on a hook above the low door, and next to it is an oak box for tokens and a small cup with ashes, in which they extinguished the torches of those who stayed too long. People in line whisper that public baths are scandalous, as if something that destroys morality is hidden behind the partitions. But at the threshold stands a guard in a coarse tunic, and on the wall above him are evenly spaced lines indicating the hours for women and separately for men, a ban on games and drinking, and a warning about fines for noise and lingering after closing time. The scandal lives in words, but here you can hear salt scattering on hot stones. There is nothing mystical about this smell, only steam on schedule. I welcome you. Thank you for your attention to this topic. Please write in the comments which city and country you are watching from, and I wish you a calm but attentive listening experience. Next will be a chronicle of how statutes and money reigned in steam and bodies, and how paper broke myths. In Hanseatic cities, bathhouses are part of the urban machinery, like storerooms, bridges, and offices. Lübeck, where the council stamps every inventory, and Nuremberg, where guilds control neighborhoods, demonstrate this more clearly than others. The archives contain the statutes of the baths: doors to be opened at dawn during the cold season, and later during the warm season. Separate hours and separate rooms to be maintained. Minors not to be admitted without adult supervision. Water to be changed according to the norm. Shelves to be dried. Barber's instruments to be boiled. Keep a supply of firewood. Take ashes to specially designated places so as not to set fire to neighboring roofs. In a separate book are the penalties for dice and cards, for drinking mash between sessions, for noise under the arches, for attempting to wash canvases in the font, for light after the closing bell. No freedom, no sterile holiness, only service, laid out like fabric under a tailor's scissors. Inside it looks less like a legend and more like a workshop. The bath attendant watches over the boilers, alternately stoking and extinguishing them so as not to overheat the arches. The barber keeps a mortar of herbs, bloodletting jars, a bowl of warm water, steel tongs, and a knife, which is dipped in boiling water before each shift nearby. On the wall, right next to the table with oil, hangs a sheet with notes. When the water was changed, when the hall was ventilated, when the chimney was inspected. At the door, the guard checks the tokens, turns over the hourglass, and makes marks with chalk so that the shelves are cleared on time. It is tedious and boring. But it is precisely this boredom that keeps the wooden city from burning down, and skin itching from turning into an epidemic. The doctor's lists show what the adults came here with: aches and pains from dampness, coughs after a change in the wind, scabies, ringworm, inflamed cuts, abrasions from belts, old splinters that couldn't be removed at home. For them, The steam room is not a temptation, but a warm room where silence keeps the pain at bay. On paper, the myth of utter debauchery sounds hollow. The charter stipulates that the guards are subordinate to the city supervisor, that the keys to the passageways are kept in a locked box, that visiting hours are posted on the doors, that bath attendants are accepted only on the recommendation of a guarantor, and are responsible with their coin and place for the carelessness of others. In Nuremberg, there is a note in the margins of the charter about separate days for women and men. In Lübeck, about checking the stoves at regular intervals with a mark in the log. There is no romance in the lists of punishments, only amounts, days, and a brief word about the offense. And yet, the legend lives on because it is convenient. It hides boring tables under the crimson word, sin. The first twist in the plot occurs when the document and the quarrel at the gate are placed side by side. The latter is louder, the former more effective. The second tool that the myth likes to use is the promise of sterile holiness. But the statutes do not mention this. They do not turn the bathhouse into a prayer hall. They turn it into a warm glass tube through which humid air is pumped on a regular basis. The church people in this picture do not look like bathhouse executioners. Parish books contain donations for the repair of stoves and chimneys, and the instructions contain dry lines about the benefits of moderation and cleanliness for health. When the bathhouses were closed in winter due to outbreaks of disease, after a few weeks, there were reports of scabies, lice, and boils from dampness. This forced them to return the steam earlier and control ventilation more strictly. Maintaining cleanliness here is not a compromise with vice, but a concern for the living. It sounds quiet, but this is the second prepared twist. Spiritual authority in this story does not destroy the steam room, but prevents it from turning into a den of disease. The pain in these places is not spectacular, but rooted in craftsmanship. The bath attendant's fingers are swollen from hot water and salt, and the skin on his palms is like sandpaper. The guard's lips crack from the drafts, and he wheezes for weeks after night shifts. The woman who carried the buckets has dark stripes on her shoulders from the straps. The barber's back aches from bending over. Visitors who go out into the cold too quickly are so short of breath that they have to sit against the wall, pressing their palms to their chests. This is the toll that steam takes on the body, honest, without tricks. And it is precisely this that makes the sanitary regulations not clerks' vanity, but protection from the disruption of normal life. Where order brings money, there is a desire to take it all. Merchant houses that own large bathhouses begin to send notes to the councils. They contain many words about the silence of the streets and good manners, and on the last page, a request to close small bathhouses for safety's sake. The arguments seem pious. Competitors allegedly have poor supervision, bad ventilation, and fuel shortages. But attached to these notes are estimates for firewood, promises to secure supplies, pay chimney sweeps, and participate in the maintenance of infirmaries. This is not pure morality, but a monopoly project in which the scandal serves as a smokescreen. If the small courtyards are removed, there will be only one stream of coins and one voice dictating the price of tokens. Thus begins a quiet war for steam, not for morals, but for the right to control the city's breath. The city responds not with speeches, but with columns. Clerks stack reports on water changes, furnace logs, ash inventories, ventilation marks, and in a separate row, moral statements without dates or measures. The comparison yields a quiet but clear result. The myth of dirt under the partition pops up more often, where the queue goes to the wrong courtyard. On the other hand, where the hours are observed, the kettles boil, and in the morning there is warm ash at the doorstep. There are fewer violations, and fines are issued for things that can be defined. Noise, cards, delays after the bell rings. On the same table, there is a simple remark about the prohibition of minors without adult supervision. It is not needed to dispose of someone else's body, but to remove the accusation from the bathhouse of something it does not do. This is where the third twist comes in. The document saves the bathhouse from both extremes. It's not a nativity scene, nor is it a monastery. It's just a place where dirt is systematically removed and violations are turned into a sum. People still whisper in the markets because rumors are easier to swallow than reading forms. They say that behind the partition, something always happens that destroys families, as if bathhouses are dragging the city into a pit. But if you put the shouting aside, the statutes show something else. Separate hours and doors for women. Separate ones for men. After closing time, silence and darkness. Games and moonshine are punishable by fines. The barber has boiling water and a logbook. The guard has keys that remain in a government box until dawn. A boring list that blows the dust off the word sin and leaves beneath it the familiar table of duties. Is this not the source of the mythmakers' anger? That their bright colors prevail not through preaching, but through hourglasses at the door? Winter cramped conditions reinforce the enforcement of rules. On cold days, the council orders an increase in the frequency of ventilation, a reduction in any mixed windows, if they existed somewhere according to local customs, and the deployment of additional supervisors on duty. Church offices support the order at this time, pointing to health and moderation. Dirt and cold do not strengthen piety, but multiply disease. The instructions are brief and emotionless, but they are repeated until they become habitual. This is not a union of ideals, but a convergence of interests. Both sides do not want an epidemic. Both agree. Both print. And in this unity of moderate words, there is much more concern for the body than in the cry that public baths are scandalous. All this order affects the skin and nerves, and people pay for it not only with money. The bath attendant does not sleep before dawn in order to heat the stoves on time. The watchman is exhausted from the night drafts. The barber's fingers tremble after the 10th rubbing session. The woman carrying buckets collapses on a bench, pressing her palms to her lower back. But this fatigue is like a tax paid to keep the city from stinking and itching. When the lines at the infirmaries grow longer during the closed season, it is obvious without preaching. The dryness of the charter is more salvific than someone else's rhetoric. And yet, wealthy homes do not give up their attempts to reshape the market to suit themselves. They propose general rules of improvement, where innocent formulas such as mandatory new design stone chimneys and fuel reserves for the entire season in advance seem reasonable, but are feasible primarily for large establishments. Behind the words, you can hear the old music of money. The city must decide whether steam will continue to serve public hygiene or become a private monopoly disguised as concern for public morals. The answer will grow out of the same paper that hangs above the guard at the door. Licenses, inspections, uniform tokens, a common matrix for seals, an open board of fines. There is still a long way to go, but for now it is enough to remember the simple difference that holds this story together. Myth paints extremes, documents count the hours. And the more carefully they count, the quieter the legends flare up. The resistance continues, even though the same neat lines hang at the threshold. The merchant houses are not backing down. They are putting neat improvement projects on the agenda, where every word seems to be about safety. They propose to oblige all bathhouses to have a stone chimney of a new design to keep a supply of firewood for the entire season in advance, and to replace the old tokens with credible notes from homeowners. The paper looks reasonable, but in reality, only large courtyards can afford such conditions. Small ones will drown in expenses and go out of business. The accompanying letters again express concern for morals, but the appendices contain estimates that reveal the main goal: to redirect the flow of people and coins. This can be seen from indirect clues. Complaints are filed on days when the queue stretched to the neighbors. The response is formulated not in sermons, but in accounting. Clerks compile ventilation logs, water change records, ash records, fine books, and furnace inspection lists into a single table. Next to them are stacked applications without dates or measures. The comparison speaks quietly, but clearly. Where the order is maintained, there are fewer violations. Where the cries of scandal are louder, attempts to stay after the bell and noise are more often recorded. The workshop foremen understand that a monopoly will hurt everyone. With a single token holder, prices will rise, and ordinary people will be left in the cold and mud. From this, they gather an initiative that is too dry to appeal to the public, but capable of keeping the neighborhoods warm. Unified licenses, a city registry, standard tokens, a public board of hours and fines, and inspections based on a single model for all. The license is born as a sheet without romance. The owner's name, guarantors, number of stoves and boilers, fuel storage location, weekly water change rate, separate visit schedule, obligation to boil barber's tools with a note in the log, ventilation procedure, space for inspector's marks, line for penalties. It was decided to print the tokens in the city workshop on a single matrix and to purchase the dye centrally, 1 shade per season, in order to catch counterfeits. The keys to the passageways at night were kept not by the owner, but by the night watchman in a government box. An extra lamp after the bell would result in a double fine, and an attempt to open the doors outside of hours would result in the loss of the license until the next season. Minors were not allowed to enter without adult supervision, and this line permanently removed the accusation that something was happening at the baths that should not be happening. A boring piece of paper with a stamp on it becomes a wall between myth and reality. The implementation is faltering. The rich offer to replace the single token with a letter of guarantee from their home, promising to make donations to hospitals and pay chimney sweeps just to get rid of the common matrix. The clerks reject this, and then the verbiage turns into pressure. They submit requests through acquaintances, remind them of old favors, whisper about the inconvenience for distinguished guests. Subtle maneuvers are recognized by the repetition of formulas. The council has a simple remedy for this: blind checks. Inspectors take turns going to large and small courtyards, checking clocks, water, ashes, and boiling logs, and in their reports, they use only license numbers, not names. A list without names disarms status, air is returned to the room, and meaning to the procedure. This administrative restructuring causes restrained pain. Bath attendants learn to keep logs and do so in the evening, when their fingers are numb from hot water and salt. Guards change night shifts more often so they don't wheeze for weeks. Barbers boil their knives longer, and the steam burns their eyes, leaving irritation. Women carrying buckets begin to work shorter shifts, but their backs still ache from the straps. On the other hand, scabies is slowly disappearing from parish lists, and pharmacists are recording fewer sales of ointments for itching. When the double windows are closed for a couple of weeks in the cold and ventilation is increased, colds still spread through the neighborhoods, but they do not turn into an epidemic. This is not a miracle or holiness. It is the boring effectiveness of measures and clocks. The whispers in the squares do not disappear. People still like to say that behind the partition there is always something better left unsaid. But near the entrance, there is a board where each courtyard now displays its license, hours, and the amount of the fine for noise, for playing, for being late, for leaving the lights on. These lines do not list vices, but rules, and turn sin into accounting. Even the most suspicious visitors get used to seeing an hourglass and a city token of the same color at the door. Where paper is next to steam, it becomes more and more difficult for myth to paint itself. It loses its footing as soon as you ask about the date, time, stamp, and boiling log. Large houses are trying another workaround: improvement rules. These hide requirements that, under a plausible pretext, push out small bathhouses, mandatory new types of chimneys, expensive stone floors, advanced supplies of firewood. The formulas sound correct, but they translate into benefits for the powerful. Here the city has only one honest move left: to separate the sanitary from the decorative. The new version of the licenses stipulates minimum safety requirements: a working chimney, tested boilers, frequent water changes, ventilation, dry shelves. Everything above that is at the discretion of the owner and the customer's wallet. For those who dreamed of a monopoly through beauty, the door is closed with a simple rule: everyone must have cleanliness, and marble is optional. It's a quiet decision that puts a stop to loud plans. After a while, the reason for starting all this becomes clear. During fair weeks, the lines at the bathhouses are long again, but the guards' reports are shorter. Fewer complaints about noise, almost no games, rare delays after the bell, and no complaints about poor supervision. Church people still talk about moderation and cleanliness as simple means of health, and their words are no longer used as a club against baths. On the contrary, they are referred to when persuading people to keep order. Doctors' notebooks contain notes that, after increased ventilation, there are fewer exacerbations of coughs among craftsmen who stood in damp conditions all day. The firewood market is leveling out. Supplies are distributed according to licenses, not influence, and in frosty neighborhoods, people no longer have to swallow smoke from overheated stoves. The flames are measured and monitored. And yet, not everyone is happy. Those who dreamed of eternal tribute and exclusivity have lost their obedient customers and the right to dictate prices. They cannot return to their old ways, but they remain irritated. Sometimes this irritation spills over into new reports of night meetings. Each such letter is checked and filed away with simple notes. The clock has not been tampered with. The lights have been turned off. The water has been changed. The stoves have been inspected. The tokens are correct. A stack of such checks, sitting on the clerk's desk, serves as the best sermon against the myth. A boring series of marks, where each fact is a nail in the coffin of a loud word. At the everyday level, everything looks almost uninteresting. Men go to their watches, women to theirs. Guards check tokens. Barbers boil instruments. Bath attendants mark ventilation. But out of this uninterestingness, a new habit has grown. Looking for a seal and a board at the door. People stopped measuring morality by whispers and began to measure order by signs that could be touched with their fingers. This does not make life easier. The cold remains cold, belts cut into shoulders. The bath attendant's eyes are cut by steam in the evenings. The guard's lips are still cracked, and the doctor's list of ailments is not getting any shorter. But the constant, clinging anxiety that the fate of the city is being decided behind closed doors disappears. Fate is decided on the board, where hours and fines are written down, and in the license, where duties are listed. The city ends the reform with what it started with at the threshold: a seal. From this day on, without it, the bathhouse will not open, the token will not work, the guard will not lift the bolt. Licenses are renewed every season, so that laziness does not set in. Inspectors are rotated so that they do not become attached to specific addresses. Reports are placed on the table of the council and workshops so that no one considers order to be a private amusement. There is nothing sublime about this dry ritual, but there is a saving consistency to it. With it, it is easier to get through the winter, easier to breathe in the steam room, and easier to argue in the market. Because when someone says again that public baths are scandalous, they will be looked at and asked to name the time, the seal, and the entry in the boiling log. If they can't name anything, the conversation will end. Steam saved the city not with holiness or debauchery, but with a schedule. And this is the only outcome in which the myth burns itself out without igniting anything but its own pay. After the introduction of seals and common tokens, life did not become cleaner in legends, but it became clearer in lists. A new board was nailed to the bathhouse door. On the left were the separate visiting hours, in the middle were the fines, and on the right was a short summary of sanitary standards. The clerk ordered everything to be written in large letters, so that even a tired craftsman could read it without squinting after the market. A small board was hung below for inspector's notes. The date, the name of the inspector, a note about ventilation, water change, and chimney inspection. You can't shout at such a board or wink at it. You can only fill it with lines. There is no room for myths there. The reform hit the habits of the powerful. Those who had money and important acquaintances were accustomed to staying after the bell, and now they were forced to leave like everyone else. Those who thought that notes from their homes would replace the common token found themselves holding the same piece of wrought metal as the onion seller. Those who had hoped to raise the price of steam in the cold weather were confronted with a seal that equalized the courtyards. Their irritation spilled over into notes about inconvenience for distinguished guests, complaints about excessive strictness of the guards, and cunning proposals to smooth over the transition period. But the city clerk understood the value of soft words. He stacked them on the edge of the table, where past formulas about scandal behind the partition lay. Next to them, he kept journals of water and ash changes. These papers smelled of something real, which meant they remained in use. Meanwhile, the guards lived their dull but necessary arithmetic. They changed night shifts more often so as not to lose their voices from the drafts, and learned not to talk idly, because an extra sound in the passageway causes unnecessary arguments. Their job seemed simple: to make sure that the lamps were extinguished at closing time, that the keys were returned to the box, that the hourglass had once again counted down to the end and calmed the impatient. Their palms bore the rough scars of a bunch of keys, and their lips had small cracks from the wind when they had to take arguments outside. They were living proof that order is maintained not by words, but by bodies that stand in the draft for the sake of someone else's warmth. Barbers were the first to embrace the new discipline because they had seen the consequences of shoddy work with their own eyes. Boiling water became not a ritual, but a duty, recorded in a logbook. Knives were left in water longer, jars were dried on a separate shelf, and massage oil was marked with the date. By evening, the barber's fingers trembled from a dozen sessions, his eyes stung from the steam, and his chest ached from the humid air. But he continued, because he understood that without these actions, scabies, festering sores, and endless itching would return to the city. The pharmacist recorded fewer sales of ointments in the weeks when the journals mentioned frequent boiling. The doctor noted that craftsmen were less likely to develop boils after working in the damp warehouse. These coincidences were quiet but stubborn, and they convinced the council better than any speech. Large houses still tried to steal control through beauty. They sent projects proposing to equip bathhouses with mandatory stone floors, new decorative partitions, and improved soot-free fireplaces. The formulas sounded decent, but they were at odds with what really protects the city. The clerks responded simply, "The sanitary minimum is the same for everyone. Anything above that is a matter of taste and wallet, not a matter of coercion. A stone floor does not cure a cough. A new partition does not replace ventilation. And a marble hearth does not make the water fresher." Only what was considered essential was returned to the board. Changing water, inspecting stoves, frequency of ventilation, separate hours, boiling instruments. All the rest of the beauty went where it belonged, to private ambitions, not to the general norm. The seasons passed, and the effect became visible in people's habits. During the cold weeks, the queues grew longer, but the punishment books contained fewer entries about noise and games, and records of delays after the bell became less frequent. People learned to arrive on time, and the guards learned to write down notes without malice. On market days, when visitors flocked to the city, the board at the entrance became their map. They read the clock, took a token, and moved on without question. There was less crowding at the doors because disputes were now settled with a finger on the seal, not with voices raised to a shout. Even those who disliked the public baths had to admit that with the seal, not only the steam, but also the street leading to it was easier to breathe. Church people retained their role, and it bore little resemblance to legends. They did not demand sterile holiness and did not replace hygiene with spiritual ecstasy. They repeated short formulas about moderation, warmth, and cleanliness as simple remedies against illness. They might ask for bathhouses to be closed for a short time during an outbreak of disease, but they were just as insistent on having them reopened after airing out, so as not to increase itching and dirt. Their contribution was not loud condemnation, but the recognition that the body needs water and responsible heat. This combination of practice and instruction proved more useful to the city than any curses or excuses. There were some exemplary punishments. A couple of times, licenses were revoked from those who tried to keep their doors open after closing time, or let a lamp into the passageway when the hourglass had already run out. The punishments, like everything else here, were dull and thankless. Fines, closure for one season, and the obligation to pay for part of the firewood for the infirmaries. These orders did not please anyone, but they quickly taught the neighbors that steam does not tolerate nighttime improvisation. Bodies accustomed to warmth must understand that fire is no joke, especially in cities where roofs are close together and the streets carry smoke like chimneys. A restrained fear of fire proved to be the best prevention against both the monopolist and the reckless lover of special conditions. Over time, the bathhouses acquired something they never had in legends: a transparent biography. Each license was valid for one season. Each board was marked by the inspector with his name and date. Each water change was recorded, and each inspection of the stoves was marked with a check mark that could be verified. If a dispute arose, it was resolved not with insults and tales, but with neighboring lines. Here they aired more often. Here they boiled longer. Here they collected fines for playing without leniency. Here the guard slept and received a reprimand. A boring story, written in even handwriting, disarmed even those who knew how to shout loudly and beautifully. The most important thing happened with the lingering fatigue that lived between the market and the steam room. It did not disappear, but it ceased to be mixed with sticky fear. People continued to freeze in line in the morning. Bath attendants' fingers continued to swell from salt and water in the evenings. Guards' skin cracked on their lips, and barbers' chests stung from the steam. But meaningless conflicts began to disappear from their lives when the rich demanded special treatment and the poor demanded the same for them. The common token extinguished this spark. The stamp removed the reason for fighting, and the board with the rules moved the dispute to the penalties column. And if anyone still tried to rekindle the old legend, the same ember flared up and died out again and again before their eyes. The myth had no fuel left. Meanwhile, the city archives learned to summarize their own experience. Clerks compiled logs of ventilation and water changes over several seasons and attached reports from infirmaries and pharmacists to them. The result was a map on which important places were found where no one had looked for them in fairy tales: near boilers, doors, and key boxes. There were no mysterious zones of vice or shining islands of purity on this map. There were bottlenecks at shift changes. There were weeks when firewood was in short supply. There were courtyards where the guard often shouted, and courtyards where the barber's wrists ached so much that he left a day early. Problems were called by their names, not labels. Solutions were sought from those who froze and sweated, not from those who wrote long speeches. This was the most sober thing the city did. It removed the mask of debauchery and holiness from the bathhouse, and left it with the face of service. When one winter brought a particularly fierce wind, the councils discussed whether to reduce visiting hours in order to stretch the supply of firewood. Such talk usually gives rise to cries of injustice in the shops. But this time, no cries were raised. People saw the boards, knew the magazines, understood that the knife was lying on their collective backs, not on someone's weakness. The conversation was difficult but businesslike. They decided to move some of the hours to the middle of the day, when the stoves kept the heat more efficiently and the wind was weaker in the openings, to increase ventilation so as not to increase coughing, to increase the breaks between shifts so that the barber's fingers would not tremble without a break, to instruct large households to take on the extra cartloads of firewood because the small ones could no longer afford to pay. No one was happy, but everyone could put their finger on the line and see their place in the common pain. Thus ended what the seals and tokens had been intended for. The pain did not disappear, but the myth did. The one that had oscillated for decades between house of debauchery and monastery. In its place remained warm air on schedule, doors with keys held by the night watchman, a barber's knife in boiling water, a guard with an hourglass, a board with a stamp, and a license sheet with a place for the next inspection. People continued to argue about the prices of tokens and the length of the queue, but they no longer argued about the nature of the baths. They were what they were supposed to be, a city service with rules, and if somewhere in an alleyway people whispered again that public baths are scandalous, there was already a coat rack with a dim sign, an ashtray with cold embers, and a seal above the line, which was enough to silence the whispering. When order was established and the boards at the entrances turned black from fingerprints, new cracks appeared, into which the myth crept. Thin sheets with edifying pictures appeared in the shops. In the haze, as if in a mirror, partitions could be guessed, and under them, bold captions about the decline of morals. These sheets were folded into baskets with onions and bunches of dill, as if, along with the groceries, one could take home anxiety. They were printed where paper was cheaper and illustrators were easier to find, and filled with borrowed words, expressions about confusion, silence, and hours were taken from the statutes and rearranged so that each point sounded like a hint. When the clerks gathered such waste paper on the table, it turned out that the pictures repeated each other, and the phrases were taken from the very paragraphs that kept order. The paper was the same, but the meaning was the opposite. This trick was disarmed in the same way as before. Magazines with water shift schedules, ventilation reports, and inspector's notes were placed next to the leaflets, and the faded fears ceased to sound. As winter approached, fuel shortages began to bite. The ice on the suburban forests lasted longer than usual. The carts were late, and the first people tempted by commercial cunning tried to hide some of the firewood at home so that they could later raise the price per token. Nothing new, just the old arithmetic of greed. In response, the council introduced a limit on the number of stoves and tied deliveries to a license. As many boilers as there were carts, and not a single log more. It looked like a dry formula, but it was felt in the flesh. The bathhouses became a little cooler, ventilation was done more often and for shorter periods, and water changes were stretched out for an extra hour so that the boilers would not run out of steam. This made the barber's eyes sting more. The bath attendants' temples throbbed at night from the humid overheating, and the guards' voices gave out more often. Drafts gained strength from the not-quite-closed shutters. However, it was during this harsh winter that the licenses proved most useful. By keeping heat to a minimum, they prevented the spread of disease. Scabies was almost non-existent in the parish records, and the pharmacist recorded fewer sales of ointment than he had expected in such cold weather. The city learned to survive the winter not through the arrogance of the strong, but through a common rule: poor in comfort, but rich in predictability. The clash of interests did not go away. Large houses, having lost hope for eternal rent, opened small rooms for personal ablutions in their courtyards, with separate entrances, and hours for the distinguished. Neat signs hung on the doors, where euphemisms appeared instead of the word bathhouse, and at the threshold were their own tokens. It was a bypass, no worse and no better than others, an attempt to wrest a piece of private warmth from the common body. The inspection turned out to be cruel, first and foremost, for those who carried it out. The inspector went from door to door, checked the records against the license, looked at the chimney, the water, the boiling log, and then took out a box of common tokens and applied them to the others. Where the shade of the die differed, so did the law. A mark appeared on such a door indicating suspension until the rules were revised. The bath attendants caught in double accounting had swollen fingers not only from the water, but also from carrying logs for free to the infirmaries. They silently pulled buckets. This was how the treasury returned to the city what they had tried to steal from it. In Lübeck, they began to compile their experience into bundles suitable for their neighbors. Letters came to the office from smaller towns. They asked for a sample of the entrance board, the license formula, the furnace inspection schedule, and the token parameters. The clerks responded reluctantly but thoroughly. They wrote down where to indicate the owner's name, how to record water changes, what to write about the ban on minors without a guarantor, how to keep a boiling log for barbers, how to count the ash in the furnace. Such letters were sent slowly and delivered by the same carters who carried firewood. The city rule, born of irritation and stubbornness, became an export commodity, not as a sign of superiority, but as a pattern that others could use to sow their own rules. Nuremberg, accustomed to the strict fortress of statutes, responded in kind. It sent its forms, where the inspection of stoves was scheduled by day, and the order of ventilation was linked to the winds. Two cities that knew the price of smoke and splashes exchanged dry lines, and there was more commonality in these lines than in loud alliances. Church people, who had previously helped to maintain cleanliness for the sake of health, gained additional support from this exchange. Short remarks began to appear in the instructions that moderation and warmth are not only virtues for the soul, but also beneficial for the body, and that cleanliness is not radiance, but labor. They did not demand the impossible, did not multiply prohibitions, but protected the rhythm. It was important to them that steam did not become a reason for self-deprecation or idleness. At their request, additional buckets and ash shovels were delivered to some neighborhoods so that in the frost, the ashes would not be carried in bags that tear at the corners and dust people. It's a small thing, but it's small things like this that remove the sticky layer of disgust for the communal bathhouse, replacing it with a dull certainty. It will be wet and hot here, but not dirty or dangerous. Against this backdrop, an old, almost forgotten element resurfaced. Bath pies, multi-layered mats, for shelves that retained heat and drained water. They were expensive, made of coarse fibers, stuffed with grass dust, rarely replaced, and if not cared for properly, they became a breeding ground for odors and skin irritation. The statutes, rewritten thanks to exchanges with neighbors, now required them to be dried on a schedule and replaced as needed, rather than at the whim of the owner. This meant extra expenses, and the rich tried again to turn the conversation into rhetoric. Too frequent replacement, they said, was a luxury that harmed the poor. In response, a concise table was hung on the board: how much it costs to treat scabies, and how much a new pie costs. The amounts were unequal, and unexpected economics won the argument about luxury. Since then, barbers have had fewer purulent scratches, and their fingers still trembled at the end of the shift, only more useful. The guards got used to their new role as witnesses. Their signatures on the board ceased to be a formality. Anyone who tried to argue was confronted with their handwriting like a stone. They learned to record not only delays in lights, but also a strange little thing: smell. If there was a sharp smell of unrefined oil in the hallway, it meant that someone was cutting corners with boiling water. If soot was coming from the chimney, it meant that someone was skimping on cleaning. Smells became a second language for the city. You couldn't argue with them. The reports included lines stating that such and such a smell had been present for so many shifts in a row, after which cleaning was carried out and the problem disappeared. It was crude, almost like making marks on doors, but it was precisely this language that both craftsmen and furnace advisors understood. Meanwhile, the merchant houses did not give up. They shifted the battle to the field of charity. They promised to pay for major repairs to the infirmary roof if they were given the right to separate night hours. They brought sacks of flour to the parish cash desks if the city relaxed the rule about keeping keys with the night watchman. And each time they ran into the same wall: one token, one seal, one board at the door. Charity was accepted, but the rules were not changed. The city finally realized that it was possible to take money and not give up the general peace and quiet in return. It was a rare lesson. Charity does not equal a license. The saturation of the reform revealed another problem. People who did not have money for frequent baths tried to wash their clothes in the fonts after closing time, hoping to save a handful of coins. The ban existed. The fines were posted on the board, but necessity stubbornly sought loopholes. A solution was found at the intersection of the charter and the infirmary. In the mornings, once every few days before opening, a short, clean window was designated for washing only coarse work clothes under the supervision of a guard with its own barrel and drain. This added work and salt to the bath attendants' swollen fingers, but it took the pressure off the cold courtyards, where cold water stood in tubs. No leniency, just reassigned labor. It was much cheaper to buy off necessity than to catch it at night with fines. Another custom came from Nuremberg, hanging small brass medallions at the entrance with the year of inspection and the mark of the city master. They were made by one workshop, and once a season, the design on the medallion was changed. This seemed excessive until counterfeit tokens of the old design, repainted with cheap dye, appeared on the market. Brass stopped the wave. It's funny, but its durable shine, which could not be faked with cheap paint, became a simple shield. The guard's fingers quickly learned to recognize fakes by touch. Those who traded in illegal tokens were punished according to a strict formula: confiscation, a fine, then compulsory labor, removing ash from public furnaces for free. Bags rested on their backs, straps on their shoulders, blackness under their fingernails, and with every breath, the arrogance of easy money flew away. Gradually, the need to talk about bathhouses in terms of sin and holiness disappeared. People began to talk about them as they would about wells and shutters. If they are closed, they freeze. If they are not cleaned, they stink. If they are left without boards, they make noise. These three verbs summed up the life of institutions that had previously been the stuff of legends, and yet the memory of old clashes lingered in people's minds like cold in their bones. It reminded them that beneath any order lay bodies: a bath attendant with swollen fingers, a guard with cracked lips, a barber with a bad back, women with black stripes from belts on their shoulders. Their pain was the price they paid for warmth and cleanliness. And while they stood at the doors and boilers, the city could afford the luxury of explaining myths instead of living by them. During one of the thaws, the street streams flowed to the sides, and water dripped from the roofs as if the stone city itself had become a bathhouse. In the shops, people began to talk again about the prices of tokens, the length of the queues, and the quality of the oils used by barbers. No one remembered the scandal behind the partition, because the heat had long ceased to be someone else's celebration. It became just another piece of accounting, as uninteresting and salvific as the inspector's mark in the lower corner of the board. And if some new sheet with pictures tried to bring back the old excitement, it would be placed on the table next to the boiling magazines and asked the same three words with which the city had learned to extinguish deception: when, where, who checked. That was enough for the smoke of beautiful phrases to dissipate and leave only the steam that runs on schedule. In spring, When melted streams flow along the stone seams, it seems that the city's veins have opened and the blood is flowing faster. During this season, it is especially clear how accounting works. Fresh marks from inspectors hang on boards with licenses at the doors of bathhouses. New tokens of the same shade spill out of the guards' boxes, and barbers' journals are filled with neat columns of boiling dates. Clerks bind reports into bundles, and in these bundles you can already see not individual days, but habits. Where heat was conserved in winter and ventilation was timed, there are fewer cases of itching and cracks in spring. Where guards changed shifts without delay, there are fewer complaints about noise. Where there were no attempts to cheat with tokens, prices are more stable. These are boring statistics, but they replace shouting. The myth of dirt behind the partition loses its power next to the tables, and the legend of sterile holiness crumbles when you see a bath attendant with fingers swollen from salt, making another note about changing the water. In the midst of seasonal concerns, large political shadows flicker, and they are also important for baths. The city on the Baltic Wind retains its right to print as a free imperial city. The city in the depths of the mainland relies on statutes reinforced by a 14th century bull. The emperor is far away, but his name accompanied the formula in which the city council was responsible for order and therefore for fire and water. This is not a formality. Any attempt to turn steam into a private privilege was blocked by the word common. When an influential house hinted that the distinguished deserved separate night hours, the council reminded itself that the imperial charters had granted the city not pomp, but competence. Competence meant boilers, keys, boards, inspections. Pomp was reserved for fair processions. While dry dust lies on political papers, salt and grease lie on working papers. Guards, who now refer to licenses by number rather than by surname, are learning to write without mistakes, because any slip-up in the bottom line makes the dispute endless. Barbers, who are used to boiling knives by the minute, argue with pharmacists about the power of herbs, and the pharmacist patiently shows that in weeks, when there are extra marks in the boiling logs, fewer ointments for itching are sold. Bath attendants, who are tasked with keeping track of ash, first frown, and then move the bucket toward the light themselves to see more clearly how many times the firebox was cleaned during their shift. This is not piety, but craftsmanship, the kind that saves not the soul but the courtyard from fire. Politics does not disappear. It simply takes on other forms. Large houses, resigned to a single token, try to act through condescending letters to advisors, promising to pay for the chimney sweep's work and decorate the facades if they allow a light inspection. The answer remains the same, like a stone step at the entrance. Inspections are random. There is only one token. The board is visible to everyone, and the keys are with the night watchman. Charity is useful, but it does not buy rules. It sounds cold, but it works in both heat and frost. The test of strength comes not from offices, but from misfortune. Once, at the end of a windy autumn, when dampness settled on the floors, a workshop caught fire in another quarter, and the fire spread along the rafters. The crowd rushed to the wells, and the guards of the nearest bathhouse tore the hooks off the barrels and dragged the water along the wall. The inspector, who happened to be nearby, drained some of the boiling water from the boiler so that it would not explode from overheating in the empty furnace. The barber brought vinegar and rags for the burned. The firemen raised ladders and knocked down the flames before they jumped across the street. The advisor's report later included a dry line. Keeping track of water and keys helped reduce response time. There was no room for myth or legend in this line. It contained only what the board on the door was for. The steam room became part of firefighting grammar, not a reason for a parable. Against the backdrop of such episodes, church people continued to speak quietly and to the point. Their teachings included lines about how cleanliness and warmth are good for the body, and moderation is protection against arrogance. When a cold wave swept over the city, they asked to move part of the hours to the middle of the day so that people would not run out into the icy fog after dark. When mice scurried in the drying rooms, they suggested allocating money from the parish treasury for new poles so that the cloth would not rot. Their alliance with the bathhouses was based on a common goal: less illness, less decay, less panic. This alliance annoyed those who liked to contrast the temple and the steam room as light and darkness. But it was this alliance that ultimately taught the streets to see steam as a sanitary service rather than a secret threat. By summer, when the windows are open wider and the winds blow more freely, another danger appears: relaxation. In the warm months, people want to put away their journals and lighten up a little on the checks because everything is fine anyway. Then they remember the tables compiled by clerks. In those years when ventilation was reduced in the summer, coughs were treated more often in the fall. In those seasons when boiling was recorded less frequently, the winter weeks were filled with itching and barbers' pricks over abrasions. These boring correlations are more convincing than any sermon. The memory of the city is strengthened not by fear, but by a table to which they return time and time again. Between the lines, class strife continues, but the shouting has stopped. The wealthy visitor no longer demands a little more after the bell, because he knows that the guard will mark his delay on the board, and the inspector will check that mark. The poor no longer try to sneak in their laundry at night, because there is a morning clean window under supervision. The merchant house no longer argues about the right to separate night hours, because the night key lies in the government box. The dispute shifts to where the city has the most power, to estimates. How to divide the cost of firewood. What rate of tokens is acceptable in frost? How many times a week to pay for barbers' boiling water from the city treasury in working-class neighborhoods? These are difficult conversations, but they allow things to be called by their price, not by their stigma. Letters arrive from neighboring Hanseatic cities requesting a sample board and a license sheet. Some need a token matrix. Others need a formula prohibiting minors without a guarantor. Still others need instructions on how to store keys. In response, copies are sent that contain no ideology, only practical logic. The same letters sometimes mention stories about sheets with edifying pictures being sold again at the fair. Now they are not even torn up. They are put into a separate folder called Rhetoric and shown at meetings along with ventilation magazines. The comparison is like a palm extinguishing a candle. If you put a whisper and a schedule next to it, the whisper disappears on its own. And yet the city is not a perfect machine. In harsh winters, there is not enough firewood. In damp springs, the shelves do not dry well. The guards break out in shouts. The barbers' chests ache from the steam. The bath attendants' hands shake from the salt. Fatigue accumulates, and it too requires regulation. The council introduces mandatory short vacations for night workers once every few weeks. Barbers are assigned assistants during peak days so that their knives do not shake in their fingers. Bathers are given gloves with thick lining, not for luxury, but for practicality. Worn-out palms make for poor work. These are all cheap measures, but they prove that rules are not a cudgel, but a protection for those who keep the city warm. At the end of each year, a bundle with a simple title is placed on the council table. The Baths of Lübeck and Nuremberg. Measures, expenses, results. On the first pages, there are barely noticeable traces of salt from the fingers of those who counted the water and ash, followed by dry columns. How many water changes? How many inspections? How many fines? How many hours of work removing ash? How many donations were sent to infirmaries? How many differences in firewood? At the end, there is a short remark about the myths that tried to return through leaflets and denunciations, and why they did not take root. Next to the board by the door, there was no room left for myths. There is no triumph in this bundle, but there is quiet pride. The city chose to count rather than track down, to dry and boil rather than imagine, to print and check rather than weep over rumors. It was precisely this choice that turned out to be the policy: quiet but decisive. And if you walk through the streets on a damp evening, when steam pours out of the cracks, you can see what this choice looks like in everyday life. A guard stands at the threshold of the bathhouse and runs his finger over a brass medallion with the year of inspection. In the dressing room, there is a fresh mark from the inspector on the board. In the passageway, a bunch of keys hangs on a hook, taken out of the government box at exactly the right time. In the steam room, the barber places a soft cloth under the knife so that his hand does not tremble. On the shelf lies a dry pie, sewn according to the norm. At the door, the woman who carried the buckets sits down on a bench and holds her hand on her waist. but her face shows that the shift is over. The water has been changed, and the steam is coming, as it should. To some, this picture may seem absurd, too mundane for the theme of sin, but therein lies the main denouement. What was called sin on schedule turned out to be a schedule instead of sin. The myth lost to the paper here, not because the myth was weak, but because the paper was rooted in the bodies. The bath attendant with swollen fingers, the guard with cracked lips, the barber with a bad back, the woman with a black stripe from the belt. Every day, they all confirmed the line of the charter with their labor. The church mentor confirmed it with his remark about moderation and warmth. The council confirmed it with its seal and refusal to sell the key. And when someone whispers again in the shop that public baths are scandalous, that whisper hits the board at the entrance and dissipates like steam. The city has chosen not the easy path, not denunciation and permissiveness, but the long road through accounting and licensing. The result is the same: warmth on schedule, cleanliness according to standards, prices according to estimates, and legends in the waste paper basket. This is an honest ending, not happy, not tragic, but brought about by the hand of a man who once hung a simple sign above the door and made it mean more than any shout.